events. I'm Vitaly Portnikov. The head of Russia's foreign ministry, Sergey Lavrov, during his speech at the so-called Forum of the Future 2015 in Moscow, laid out Russia's plan to continue the war in Ukraine while simultaneously imitating diplomatic efforts. Sergey Lavrov told the forum participants that the so-called Russian special operation in Ukraine would continue, but at the same time it could also be accompanied by so-called diplomatic efforts. However, the head of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs explained what the negotiations between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations should be about. First and foremost, about humanitarian issues, the exchange of prisoners, and other aspects related to the humanitarian track in the Russian-Ukrainian war. In other words, everything appears quite simple and transparent. As I have repeatedly said, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, envisioned a different course of events where Kyiv and Moscow agree on a ceasefire on the Russian-Ukrainian front and subsequently negotiations begin for a lasting peace between these two countries. Putin, from the very beginning, had a different plan to continue negotiations while hostilities were ongoing. And although at first Trump did not agree with this plan, in May, the President of the United States effectively adopted the position of the President of the Russian Federation. We even know the exact day when this happened after a phone conversation with Putin, which was directly related to the effective failure of the first round of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, where they managed to agree only on humanitarian issues. Donald Trump told European leaders and the President of Ukraine that he was satisfied with the outcome of his conversation with Putin, that he had never insisted on an unconditional ceasefire, and that he was abandoning the idea of imposing the previously agreed tough sanctions against the Russian Federation so as not to disrupt the negotiation process. So in fact, the diplomatic initiative is now on the side of the Russian leader. Putin can simulate the negotiation process. The Russian and Ukrainian delegations can meet in Istanbul or any other place, discussing not issues of a ceasefire, not issues of war and peace, but exclusively humanitarian matters, which are not actually part of the negotiations to end the war. And Donald Trump will perceive this negotiation process simulated by Russia as successful and will not interfere with the Russian president continuing his offensive on Ukrainian soil. Because in reality, if the American president agreed to impose new serious sanctions against the Russian Federation and cut off communication with Putin and other Russian officials, this would at least indicate new economic problems for the Russian Federation and a new diplomatic failure for Putin. But this is exactly what Putin did not get from Trump. Lavrov also says that sooner or later, the results of the so-called special operation on the ground will be formalized in legal documents. And this, so to speak, is the next stage of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians may realize that they are unable to capture the entire territory of Ukraine and therefore wish to fight for as long as they have the resources and for as long as the United States and other Western countries allow the Russian Federation to do so. But when the so-called Russian special operation has to be ended simply because there will not be enough resources to continue it, the Kremlin would like Ukraine and other countries of the world. And this is the first point of the so-called Russian memorandum to recognize the Russian status of the Ukrainian territories occupied by Moscow. Today, these are the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Sevastopol, and the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine. However, we understand that the Kremlin would like to add to these Ukrainian regions as much Ukrainian land as the Russian army is able to seize. And I would not be deceived by all these statements from Russian officials claiming that the Russian army is now creating a buffer zone in regions of Ukraine neighboring the occupied territories, or in those regions of Ukraine that border the internationally recognized territory of the Russian Federation. No, the Kremlin does not need any buffer zones. Of course, at the initial stage of its occupation actions, the Kremlin may claim that this is a buffer zone, but later, yet another fake referendum is held in the buffer zone territory about the creation of a pseudo-independent state, and then the annexation of this so-called independent state to the Russian Federation. Well, we've seen all of this before in Crimea, in Donbass, and in the south of Ukraine. And then the Kremlin demands that Kyiv withdraw Ukrainian troops from Ukrainian territory. And this is exactly what is supposed to be formalized in a legal document from the point of view of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. In other words, Putin's plan is quite simple. Point 1, to continue the war with Ukraine for as long as the Russian Federation has enough financial, economic, demographic, and military resources for it. Point 2, during this war, to imitate the negotiation process in order to maintain the possibility of communication with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and to prevent the introduction of new, harsher sanctions against the Russian Federation, or at the very least, to give Donald Trump and his circle the opportunity to block new sanctions against the Russian Federation from the American Congress and from the United States' European partner. Point 3, when the advance of the Russian army on Ukrainian soil has to be halted to secure from Ukraine and from Western countries international recognition of the Russian status of the seized Ukrainian territories, with the signing of corresponding agreements, as well as amendments to the Ukrainian constitution. Such is the ambitious and brazen plan of the aggressor, which remains brazen precisely because it is being allowed to continue its actions, and even attempts are made to justify this continuation, as we have repeatedly seen in numerous remarks by Donald Trump and other American politicians from the far-right political camp. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe, and follow me on social media or support pages to help these resources. You can sponsor on YouTube. Wishing you victory and good luck